Hello, my name is Yuli Somme. We were discussing my surname. I'm half Norwegian. It's a very difficult name to say in English, so Yuli Somme will do. I live in England in a village on Dartmoor, which is a national park, southwest England. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and my background, and I'm going to tell you about how I sort of shifted from being a craftswoman. I'm still a craftswoman, but I shifted into the funeral industry by some strange chance, which I will tell you about. So I'm going to sort of try and give you an overall view of how this came about. So the business I created 20 years ago is called Bellacouche. So I will tell you about how that came about too. And then at the end, we can have a little discussion and you can ask me some questions if you want to. So this first picture, I can't find my notes because it's on the screen in the background and I can't toggle back and forth. So I'm going to ad hoc this talk. Hope I don't leave too much out or put too much in, that it's clear. So this is me back in 1983. And I started as a weaver, a spinner and a weaver, weaving linen here, pure linen, which I'd dyed to make cloth. So I was born in Norway, Norwegian father, English mother, and when I was 5, my father died, and I have 2 siblings, and my mother wanted to come to England to be nearer her family, so we shifted to South Devon. And then I grew up there and became very interested in, I suppose, in my roots really, weaving, knitting, embroidery. It's a very Norwegian sort of thing that every girl certainly would have done, you know, of my generation. And it resulted in me following this pathway. But I was sort of quite divided as well. I was really interested in farming and thinking about becoming a farmer. And in fact, I travelled to New Zealand and spent 6 months travelling around New Zealand from farm to farm on a scheme called WOOF, it was called, those days it was called Working Weekends on Organic Farms. Actually, it was pretty shambolic at that time, and I found myself up, you know, endless lanes trying to find farms that didn't exist. But I had a good time and enjoyed myself, and also met people who were weaving and using natural dyes, so it was quite informative. So in my life, I've always seen that farming and textiles are actually very connected because fibers for textiles have to be grown if they're natural fibers, and that's what my work is about. So the fibers that I've always been most interested in are particularly wool, because that's what we can grow on Dartmoor. And in the UK, and we have a huge tradition of it, and it's been, for better or worse, it's the wool industry that kick-started the Industrial Revolution through the invention of machinery to spin wool, speed up the spinning of wool, and then later on it mechanized weaving as well. So the wealth of the UK was built up on the backs of sheep, basically. So, you know, in my story is the entanglement of farming, of our history and heritage, my own heritage, but also the environment, I suppose. So I ended up working at a mill in East Devon. It was actually, by then it was a museum, a wool museum, and this is about this period at the early 80s. Then the 90s I spent having my children and you know, focusing on that, but I sort of shifted to felt making, and at the end of the 1980s. Felt making is a very, very ancient craft, but it was very new to me, and it was very new to our culture, actually, the tradition of making felt. So there were no teachers. I had to learn sort of on the hoof. I was at college at the time, just experimenting, but because I had this sort of background interest in wool and fibre, it felt very, you know, I felt like it was something that, I can't express this properly, actually. It felt very natural to me to work with the wool fibres to make felt. So felt making in a traditional sense is applying, having combed out and teased out the fibres, making layers. You pour water on and sprinkle a bit of soap in some form, and then you roll it. And the friction and moisture makes the fibres tangle up into a mat, and you end up with this very usable fabric. So I was experimenting. Then at the end of last century, I'd become a member of the Devon Guild of Craftsmen, and which is quite a well-known guild. And they were putting on an exhibition called Treading Lightly, which was designed to show how makers like myself are mindful of the impact on the environment of their work. So I was invited to take part, and, you know, thinking, well, what shall I make? And I started thinking about our history. I've always been interested in our social history, and remembered this law that the dead must be buried in wool. It was enacted in the late 1600s, 1666 to be precise. So the dead must be buried in wool. And I'd actually remembered this one thing from school. I hated school. And somehow it touched my heart. I'd always remembered that fact. Maybe it was because of this held grief about my father, which hadn't, it was always latent in my body. And somehow I, you know, because of my love of wool and knitting and the comfort that it gave me, maybe I found that that fact, you know, had lodged in my brain, and it sort of surfaced. So I started then thinking about the cycle of life and the cycle of wool. So here in the UK, and particularly on Dartmoor where I live, we have sheep. We used to have a lot more sheep. Our national flock numbers has reduced drastically. But I was sort of thinking, our planet is in such crisis. It would be so good to reconnect you know, ourselves with the cycle of life. I felt like we've disconnected from the cycle of life. We don't even talk about our mortality. At least we didn't then. I think we're beginning to now. And so, you know, for me, the wool fibre itself represented that cycle. Here it is growing in the fields outside. I could shear a sheep, make a shroud, and bury myself or somebody in this shroud. And it just symbolizes that whole cycle. I suppose it symbolized for me more as well, in that it was a gentle approach. And, you know, we live in this sort of very fast world where everything is so speedy, you know, funerals are so speedy, we're pushed into doing things that we're not happy with for funerals quite often. And, you know, so I started thinking about the whole issues around death and funerals. Personally, until that point, my feelings about death were in some ways obsessive. I thought about it every day, but in quite a sort of fearful way. And it was certainly a taboo subject for me. I think if there's something that you worry about, you might think about it a lot, but not talk about it because it's so scary. And I think this arose because when my father died, I was, of course, very young and didn't really understand what was going on. And I was shielded from the whole process. He died in our house. My siblings are older, two and 4 years older. And they were distraught, and I was just sort of baffled what was going on. And we were told things like, Papa has gone to a better place. You know, so what does that mean? Can I go there? Can I see Papa now? You know, this word, he has died, wasn't used. So it was all kind of puzzling. And then it was compounded by 6 months later, us leaving Norway. It was a beautiful place. We lived on the edge of a fjord, one of the biggest fjords, Molde Fjord, right in the middle of Norway, with these massive mountains, some of the biggest mountains in Europe, as our view. And we came, you know, that was traumatic, leaving it all, leaving our friends, coming to a place called Dartmouth in South Devon, which literally was like a goldfish bowl after Norway. Dartmouth is the mouth of the River Dart, so it's a harbour. But I missed Norway so much. I would look out at our view in Dartmouth and imagine these mountains. You know, it was traumatic. So we didn't go to Papa's funeral. So that was baffling too. He just sort of disappeared. And, you know, our poor, you know, grandmother and my aunts and so on, they tried, I suppose, in their way at those, you know, this is 1961, tried to do the best that they could. But, you know, at that time it was thought it was best to not really talk to the children about what had happened, but just hope for the best. And in various ways, the three of us, you know, suffered in different ways, and mine turned into sort of various silly phobias. So rolling back to 1999, which was when I was thinking about this cycle of life and this gentle possibility of making a woolen shroud for something. At that time I was thinking maybe this is a universal shroud. I made several of them based on the idea of a pod. So this, sorry, I've sort of slightly lost my way with this because I'm rambling a bit, but it's because I haven't got my notes, because this is a screen issue here. So I'm just going to toggle to my next slide and take it from here. And I'll come back to this story. So this is sheep's wool, and it, you know, for me, it's about the roots of everything. Where do things come from? And I was very much aware that coffins, you know, these huge boxes are, they terrify me. I really don't like them. I don't like the look of them, the shape of them. I don't like the way that the lid is snapped down and that's it. That's the end of the person who has died. It feels harsh, but it's also you know, it's resources. It's resources from somewhere. And mostly it's from all over the world. There's no provenance, you know, where does it come from? What trees are being cut down? What glues have been used? What plastics are in there? So this experiment for myself, making a shroud, was very much about, you know, rolling back, how can we simplify this? So wool is a wonderful, this is, you know, wonderful fiber, and I've worked with it a lot. So this shroud started to form in my mind. This is a native breed here, and this is called a grey-faced Dartmoor sheep. You can see how the grass is growing up around it. So I see so much, this is where my interest in farming comes in. I see so much around here, sheep-wrecked fields where the grass is nibbled down, you know, to millimeters, probably 1 or 2 millimeters. It's ridiculous. There's no shelter for them. They get hot and so on. This picture is actually taken in the field where my mother is buried. And so she was buried in 2010. So this is 10 years after I started my business. But it sort of personifies the cycle for me, you know, that we look at sheep in a different way. We manage them in a different way. We look at different, less meaty breeds and more woolly breeds. And we think about a holistic management rather than just bunging them in a field and there they are for months on end. You know, there's all sorts of problems with that. And when you have sheep in a field like this, where there is shelter and a much healthier sort of cycle going on, then that's all the better. But I'll come back to this in a little while. So the picture on the right here is polyester fabric, which I took off the internet. And the picture on the left is a sheep shearing event at the farm where I source some of my wool. It's an organic farm in Somerset. So this slide here is about how I've been influenced by my cultural roots. This is fantastic weaving by a woman called Hanna Ryggen. She lived in Norway, but she was actually half Swedish, half Finnish. And I think my work has always had a political element to it. And so I have done sort of in the past, when I was making felt by hand, I was doing political banners, and there was one thing I did around about 2008 called Power Line, and it was actually bunting. I haven't managed to put a slide up of it, but it was all those bankers in 2008, and I undressed them. So they were naked men, just hanging as bunting. And, you know, I've done other banners about genetic modification and so on. But this woman, Hanna Ryggen, she lived on a farm. She was a farming person with her husband, and she sourced all her materials from her farm. So the linen, which is the warp, the vertical threads, you can just see at the top there. I'm not sure if she grew the flax for the linen, but she spun it. And of course the wool, which is the weft here, she was from her own sheep, and she spun that, and she sourced the dyes, the colours here, from her farm as well. And as you can see, this is part of a huge tapestry depicting the Nazi occupation of Norway in the 1940s, which my father was subjected to as well. And that's a whole other story of my family roots, really. But what I found about Hanna's work is that she wasn't afraid to show her work in this way. And in fact, this tapestry was hung in a public place, and the occupying Nazis never saw it because it was woman's work, it was soft, and she got away with it. Whereas her husband, who worked for the underground movement in Norway, which my father did as well, he was arrested and put in jail in Oslo for a part of the war. And actually, it turns out it was the same jail that my uncle was in and was eventually tortured and shot there. So I feel there's a sort of connection between Hanna Ryggen and myself. And I just take this inspiration, you know, be brave and say what you think. I just feel this is such powerful work. And she had a wonderful exhibition here in Oxford about 2 or 3 years ago. Her work is monumental. I mean, 5 meters sometimes these pieces are, and they're just real treasures and inspiration for me. So this picture shows how in our culture back in the 17th and 18th century, and especially around Dartmoor, sometimes you might find a gravestone that says, here lies, you know, Rebecca, somebody, she was buried in wool. And so that was to avoid having a fine of £5. You would find £5 if you were buried in any other fibre or in a coffin. So you'll often find these in parish records, these kind of certificates that that avoids that fine. So this is the first shroud that I made. So at that point I was making wet felt. So there are 2 different ways of making felt: wet felt and then needle felting, which has become so popular in the last few years. But to me at that time, 1999, needle felting wasn't a thing in my head, and it wasn't even widely available at that time, and I was making wet felt. So it's a lot of energy, physical energy, to make something this big. It was molded seamless, so you know, this was a big pod, like a bean pod, and it had so you could crawl inside. I'm sorry, I haven't got a picture of the finished thing, but this was my workshop was a stable, and the floor drained the water away, and I just spent days and days making this shroud and several others, because I wasn't quite happy with the first one. In that process, it's exhausting. Days of literally rolling this felt back and forth, putting pressure on it, sometimes with my arms, sometimes with my feet. And I found it incredibly cathartic. I would sing to the rhythm of the rolling, sometimes sort of chanting in a way. It's very rhythmic. And to my great surprise, you know, I wasn't expecting this to be therapeutic at all. It was quite hard work and quite annoying that I had to do all these hours of rolling, you know. But in that process, a sort of mindfulness came into me about what I was doing, and really thinking about my death, and thinking about, well, what happens to a body once you've died? You know, what happens to it? And I come from a background of a family interested in gardening and the environment and composting and so on. So I was thinking, well, it involves billions of little mouths, you know, to chew me up. Really thinking about that. And as I say that, anybody listening, I can feel them going like this, you know. But actually, you know, this thing about the cycle of life is so profound and so beautiful. And I feel it is important to think about it. For me, it was, you know, even though I didn't like to think about my death or death in general, it was always clear to me that I would not want to be cremated, because that just destroys something that is of this planet, and it sends it into the atmosphere, which is polluting. So always for me, it's been about burial. And then as I came into the funeral world, I found this part of the funeral world which is about natural burial. And so rather than thinking of this as a frightening and horrible thought, I started thinking about, this is really what the cycle of life means. It means that when I die, my body as I know it doesn't just disappear, it becomes part of billions of other creatures. So in some ways, you know, I will still live on as these little billions of creatures, billions of me, billions of bits of me in other little creatures. And actually that's quite beautiful when you really think about it. And this, because I was putting so much physical effort into this, and then really tuning into this idea, this concept, it was cathartic. That's all I can say. It was so transforming, such a transforming process, that action. And this is a picture of some embroidery I've done more recently. As I've developed, I've combined needle felting with embroidery. And it just is part of a whole piece based on my compost in my allotment. So I have allotment behind my house, and we were clearing some leaves, and these are the actual sizes and shapes of these leaves, and I just thought they were so beautiful. I used them as templates for this shroud, which I made, which is a compost heap. And I was intending this piece to be for myself, but actually somebody has bought it, so I'm going to have something different. So going back to this transformation from being a craftswoman to thinking about the possibility of making shrouds in a more commercial sense. It took a few years, actually. There was nothing planned, and I actually started working with somebody else called Anne Belgrave, who's also a felt maker. And it really started a couple of years after this exhibition, when I'd put my work into the exhibition, Treading Lightly exhibition. Somebody local to me rang me up and said, my husband has a terminal illness, and we'd like you to make a shroud for him out of our wool. And I went, oh, really? Right. I had sort of gasp privately, and, you know, okay, I thought this is a new challenge for me, and I've put this shroud out there, so why not? You know, this might bring some comfort to the family. It will certainly be an interesting thing for me to do. So I found myself with a notebook and tape measure going down to their house and talking to the husband, who was in bed by then. He was very accepting of his death. He told me his size, I didn't have to measure him. And I got the fleeces and started the process, and I made him a shroud. His son at the time was about 11 and fairly distraught, and had been talking about having a lead-lined coffin. So in a way, his son was going through the sort of things that sort of possibly the sort of feelings that I've had in my past, of fear, and, you know, wanting to preserve his father's body in a lead-lined coffin and so on. And anyway, I made this shroud, and this boy was very resistant to the idea, but the husband and the wife were absolutely certain that this would be a good thing. And then I delivered it, and the boy was there, and his face really changed when he saw it. And he said to his mum, can I sleep in it tonight? And I just thought that was amazing to really, to be so changed by this shroud, by the look of the shroud, and sort of almost like an invitation. um, so that happened. That was my first burial in Chagford, here where I live. And then about a year later, I had another, you know, person wanting a shroud. She was also terminally ill, and, you know, I found myself in the same situation, rather gasping at what do I do? You know, how do I approach this? But that's what happened. And by then I had started working with Anne a bit more about the whole concept and how were we going to do this. Clearly I could not make the shrouds by hand, this wet method, if I was going to do it as a business proposition. So I found a local mill, literally just 20 minutes down the road. That part of Axminster Carpets is actually quite a famous company, and they were processing and turning wool into yarn for making the carpets down there, but they were also processing wool into underfelt, so like here. And so I approached them and said, could you make felt for me from wool that I've sourced? And they said, yes. We had some discussions. And it ended up with me actually hiring a man with a long wheelbase van. And we went around various farmers that I knew, organic farms registered, and we picked up their annual clip, usually about 400-500 kilograms. And we took it to the mill and they would scour it for us, which is the washing process, and then turn it into felt. So that is me looking very pleased with myself with the felt. And that was wonderful for a few years. I was able to take wool direct to the mill and have it felted to my specification. Unfortunately, that mill has now closed down and I have to have my felt made in Yorkshire, but it's still from wool that I have sourced myself. So I've sort of managed to keep that provenance going. So by this time, so this is the early 2000s, I had founded a new workshop space, slightly bigger, and it was an old ancient barn right by the church in Chagford. It happened to be called Bellacouche, which means beautiful resting place, and is actually a barn where they used to make and store coffins. So it seemed like that must be the name for my business. Anne and I formed a sort of partnership where she built up the website and I did the practical work. And then we would get together for a few days and do some designing. And eventually we came up with a whole idea of this thing that I now sell, the leaf cocoon. This is a little book, small, you know, self-printed book called Deeply Felt, which actually is on my website and you can buy it. And it sort of has this story amongst the other things that I've talked about my work being on the political sort of, there's always an element of politics in there, and environment. And so this book sort of explains that journey. And this is where we came, what we came up with. It's called the leaf cocoon. It has a wooden base, which is encased in felt, padded out with 6 handles. There's a shroud that is attached and sewn into the base with straps, and then the whole thing is covered. You don't have to have the cover, but most people do, to sort of to cover the whole thing and to give it a smoothish outline. So at that point, I was sort of mindful that the concept of shrouds, so this is the early 2000s, was really quite alien to our Western culture, because I think people envisage this sort of Egyptian image of a mummified body where you see the shape, you know, and it's a cloth that is wound round and round. And it's a bit confrontational for our sensitive Western eyes. So I was very mindful that I wanted to design something that was somewhere between a coffin and a shroud, that we could feel a better connection with the person who's died, but without it being too confrontational, perhaps too in your face, I suppose. And that's why I came up with this idea, which I sort of subtitle a soft coffin, so that you get the idea that you don't need a coffin. There is no coffin, you know, conventional coffin, wooden thing, and all the resources that that involves. It is made of wool, almost entirely, apart from the wooden frame, so it's safe. So 2013, there's the Good Funeral Guide annual awards, and I won the award for I don't know what it was called, the best funeral product or something like that. So really, really proud to have got that. Ironically, that the prize was a wicker model of a coffin. So but it does show that there's a sort of green element to these awards. So I'm now working completely on my own. Anne is, she didn't want to be involved in the physical side of this, and she became a sort of a sleeping partner, and has now, is now sort of in the background with me, but I've just worked, built up the business on my own pretty much, with one or two other people helping. And here we are. This is a plain one. This is it unfolded. So, you know, there are pockets at both ends for the feet and the head, and then double wrapped. So there's a feeling of coziness, really, and certainly a sort of soft enfoldment of layers of felt. So this is my own mother's burial. We walked, she was a Christian, and so is my sister. And so we had a sort of church funeral, and the vicar really entered into this whole thing. And her place of burial is about a mile up an extremely steep hill from the village church. But the vicar got his welly boots on and led our procession up the hill. We carried her all the way up to a field. We have had permission from the owner of the field to put her in there. And actually there have been 3 other burials since. So my mother was the first. So you can see how it's carried, and it's very easy to handle. So most of my work, sort of going back to this one actually, my work with Bellacouche has always been to promote the element of possibility of natural burial. This movement has been going since a man called Ken West started it. I don't know, probably Claire, you might know this, probably about 35 years ago up in Carlisle. So he created the first natural burial site. And so it was getting away from the idea of headstones, but actually returning our bodies to nature in a much more natural way. So shallower graves, allowing nature to sort of take its part rather than endlessly strimming churchyards and you know, keeping nature at bay. A natural burial site is not about allowing brambles and nettles to take hold and that's it. You lose sight of where your loved one may be buried. It's about a different way of management. And in this case, where my mother is buried, it's a field with sheep in, and it's a holding. It's probably about 40 acres. Part of the place is woodland, and part of it is grazing for sheep. but there is now, I've been in discussions with the owner, Jeremy, because we've now got 4 burials there. We're talking about applying for planning permission for a full burial, meadow burial. So it will be a wildflower meadow, but also having an element of rewilding, which is a word that is being used a lot at the moment around the world, and in Australia and New Zealand as well, I know. And it's about letting nature take its own path, and that requires a lot of our own patience. But that's slightly irrelevant to what I'm talking about now, except that where my mother is buried at the moment, we're talking about allowing that part of the land to rewild itself. And so, you know, because I want to know where my mum is buried, I will go and trim around her just so that I know where to go and I know where she is. But that is something that we've just started talking about for one part of this burial ground. But the other part of the burial ground, we're planning a properly managed meadow burial, where there will be a management plan that will be adhered to. What's been nice about being this, following on from Claire's talk and the person previous to her, is that I think it sort of ties us all in very nicely. The first person, I can't remember her name, but she was talking about natural burial so eloquently and setting up a place in Australia. Claire then talked also beautifully about how her experience with her father's death brought her closer to the whole process and managing the whole process herself. And so following on from that, what I'm talking about here is how can we do this? You know, this is one option, the wool option. There are, of course, other options, including proper wooden coffins. But this is my offering to the whole thing, and so I sort of feel that this is, you've planned these talks really well. You know, we've got the person talking about the natural burial, we've got Claire talking about her experience with her father and the whole process of slowing down the way that we deal with our dead, slowing it down, engaging children, so that we can fully understand and take this into our bodies in a slow way. If we can start a slow movement for funerals like we have with food, I think this will help our spirits to accept this cycle of life in a more beautiful and less panicky way. So that is what this has been for me, is part of this national movement in the UK, but also across the world, you know, so reaching out to you Australians and people in America, that Claire and I have been communicating with too. So currently 79% of our funerals in the UK are cremations. And I've sort of battled with this idea. You know, I'm so often asked, you know, people want to order something and it's for a cremation. And that for me is very complicated, or it was, because my leaf cocoons were not, I mean, I have had a few cremations with them, but I've had to have endless conversations with both the funeral director and the crematoria, sending photos, you know, what is it, how can we adapt it to the cremator so that it's safe and there's no flashback and all that sort of thing. So for years I just thought, no, I'm not going to go down that route. I'm just going to focus on natural burial because that's what I passionately believe in. But eventually I thought, you know, I am missing something here, and perhaps I can make something that will have less emissions and actually still give people this sort of sense of a connection with the person who has died. So this is what I came up with. I I did for a while. I made some, I did a collaboration, actually inspired by Claire, with Kath Prattley in Dorset. And she made a willow base, and I made the shroud and a cover for it. And actually they were beautiful. I'm sorry, I haven't put the picture in, but I've kind of wound that down because of the complication of transporting the willow part to my workshop, which added a cost to it, and then sending it from me out to the person. So it was kind of like a double lot of transport. So in the end, I started collaborating with a local woodworker who was already making coffins himself. And this is what we came up with. So he's literally just 20 minutes down my road, and I can pick these up very easily. And then I kind of, what I call dress them. I put the hemp handles on, and I make the shroud and cover the handles with wood and felt, and so that they're practical, and then make the cover. And so this is more practical for me to send out. I've had it tested as well for cremation, so that it's easy to use. It will go into the cremator without getting snagged or anything. And it was inspired again by my Norwegian roots, the Oseberg ship. It was an ancient burial ship, Viking ship, which I've seen many times, and I just loved the shape of it. So we've kind of had that in mind when we were thinking of this design. So this is all made from reclaimed timber with hemp handles. Hemp is a wonderful fiber, very green in many ways, and I hope that we shall start growing it without having to buy licenses. It would be great if we could get back to growing hemp in this country, and then relearning how to process it into fabric. At the moment, this has to come from Europe. So I wanted to say something about the handles. On the left is a coffin handle, which tries to look like brass, but is in fact plastic. So a conventional coffin has plastic. It has glues, which are PVA based, plastic based. There's often a liner, which might be plastic too, or it might be cotton. Cotton has a massive carbon footprint to it. It's not, unless it's organic, which it won't be in a coffin. You know, it's not a good fiber for us to be using. That's a whole other thing that you can look on my website and read my articles on there about fibers and textiles. So on the right, I've taken a lot of time to design the handles so that they are practical. They don't squash your hand when you carry them. There's a wood thing insert inside. They reach right underneath to the other side. They're very, very strong, can take tons of weight, but they're also soft, so they're covered with felt. And I feel it's really important. I love the idea of the family carrying their loved one to the grave rather than funeral directors, a hired team. This isn't for everybody, of course, because you have to be reasonably strong. But if the family can be involved in the pallbearing, I think that's part of a process that connects us more. It's part of that connection. And so the handles are really important. It's a very tender act to carry your loved one or your friend to a grave with your friends. It's a very tender part of any ceremony, and it should be, we should look at that, how we do it, and count it as important. So this person died in Widdicombe in the Moor, a famous place, Uncle Tom Cobley and all. And we actually cared for her body they live in the vicarage here. We cared for her body in the home. It was August, and it was 12 days before she was buried. And we put her in her leaf cocoon, in her bedroom on her bed, and we used Claire's ice packs, and her body was perfectly preserved until the burial. And the reason for this is that wool is very, very insulating, and it will insulate, keep a temperature constant despite ambient temperatures. So although it was warm outside, her body was actually frozen inside this leaf cocoon, quite extraordinary. So that is another element of natural burial too, the possibility of a home-based funeral. So we had people wearing, she loved hares, so I made her a hair cocoon. And we had the pallbearers were wearing felt masks made by another artist, local artist. If you have any questions, please do ask.